It's dusk here on Russet House Farm, and that's a good time to talk about the rapture. I'm going to begin with a short story that takes place in the UK, because you need to understand that the rapture is a uniquely North American phenomenon. So an English student came to her professor and said, "Sir, could you explain the rapture to me?" And he said, "Well, think about it this way. One day you'll be looking out the window and suddenly you'll see all these people rising up to heaven. And you'll say to yourself, well, I'll be damned." That basically sums it up. The rapture is the idea that at the end of time, the end of history, all believers will be whisked up to heaven to live with God forever. Now here's the only problem with that idea. It's not really biblical. In fact, it's a pretty recent innovation in biblical history. It all started in the 1820s in some revivals that happened in Glasgow. And a young 12-year-old girl had a vision in which, indeed, the whole church was whisked up to heaven to be with God. And it might have just stayed there, except one of the people at this revival was the Reverend John Darby. And John Darby was the founder of the Plymouth Brethren, oddly enough, which doesn't allow women to have authority. But he was really taken with this vision that this young girl had had. And so when he came to North America, he brought this vision of the whole church being raptured into heaven with him. And once he got to North America, somebody named Dwight L. Moody heard about it. Now, he's the founder of the Moody Bible Institute and was also a very famous revivalist preacher at the time. So he started spreading the idea of the rapture around in his preaching, until eventually, when the Schofield Reference Bible was written, headings about the rapture were written into that Bible, so that what people saw when they were reading was a heading that said, "Jesus predicts the rapture." That makes it sound pretty authoritative, doesn't it? So the rapture became current in North American evangelical thought, starting in fairly small circles and then becoming wider and wider, more widely believed. Now, as I said at the outset, the problem is it isn't really biblical. So let's take a look at those texts. The first is Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verses 36 to 44. This is the text, of course, where it says that the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah, when people were eating and drinking, and then the flood came and swept them all away. Now, that ought to give you a hint as to what's going on in the text, because the question becomes, who is taken and who is left? In the days of Noah, it's very, very clear. It's unbelievers who are taken away, who are swept away from the earth. Noah and his family were left. They were tillers of the soil. They were left to continue bring God's shalom to all creatures. In fact, the disciples actually say, in the parallel passage to this, in Luke 17, the disciples say to Jesus, Where are they taken? And Jesus says, "Where the corpses are, there the vultures will gather." It's kind of an ominous image of judgment, isn't it? So the Matthew 24, that first text that's used as an apology for the rapture, doesn't really say anything about believers being whisked up to heaven. Now the other text is 1 Thessalonians 4. 1 Thessalonians 4 is, of course, a passage in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. And the people of Thessaloniki were worried because some of their members were dying. And they were worried about how these members of the community could now participate in the coming kingdom of God if they had already died. And so Paul starts to tell them what will happen when the Lord comes again. And he talks about the perusin, the coming of the Lord. And the first thing you need to know about this text is the perusin is a word that's used often for the coming of an ambassador or even the emperor to a city. And when they come to the city, they are coming as honored guests to visit that city. That's the context for the word perusin, the coming. And the image that's given, Paul says, is that when Jesus comes, the dead will rise first to meet him. And if you can picture an ancient city with walls around it, and maybe you can't, what you need to know is outside, the road outside the city was lined with the tombs of people who had died. So the image that you're getting is Jesus coming in this kind of state visit to the city, and all those tombs are opening and the dead are rising first to meet him. And then that's the second important word that we need to talk about. The word apentesis. Oh, that's 2 Peter 3. I've got the wrong card here. To meet, apentesin, to meet the Lord in the air. This word is only used for a delegation, a group of people that's going out to meet somebody to welcome them back into the city. This doesn't mean that you're meeting somebody and then you're going away with them. The images of Jesus coming down and believers going up in the air to meet him, to escort him back to the earth. Just like a royal personage would be greeted by city ambassadors and escorted back into the city. This word is only used that way in the ancient world, and in fact the two other occurrences of it in the New Testament are exactly that kind of usage. Acts chapter 28, where Paul is met by believers on his way to Rome and they escort him to the city, and Matthew 25, where the virgins are waiting outside to meet the bridegroom and escort him in. So the vision we have here is Jesus coming down, being met by all these believers, the dead rising first, who will then accompany him into the city, or accompany him, I should say, to the earth, where he is going to dwell with us. And in fact, that's the image we have everywhere else in the New Testament. We don't actually have believers being whisked up to their eternal home ever. So in 2 Peter 3, you had a glimpse of this earlier, it says that we wait for a new heaven and new earth where justice is at home. Isn't that a great vision? Don't you want to wait for that new heaven and that new earth? Or at the end of Revelation 21 talks about God coming down from heaven to dwell with us on the new earth. And that's a new earth with rivers and trees and fruit, all of that. God comes to dwell with us. God comes to dwell with the earth creatures, because that's what we were meant to be from the very beginning, earth creatures. And I don't know about you, but I find this an incredibly attractive vision. I'm so glad that this is what the biblical vision is, because you might notice that I am surrounded here. I'm in the embrace of some trees. The Grandfather Locust tree on our property. And the idea of being whisked away from this tree to live some disembodied existence in heaven, well, that's not very attractive. And that's not very biblical. I'd rather stay right here in the embrace of the earth, because that's where earth creatures belong.